I'm not opposed to long movies. Some of my best friends are long movies. Schindler's List, Lord of the Rings, Lawrence of Arabia. The catalogue of great movies longer than 3 hours is as long as Oppenheimer's IMAX reel. I agree with Roger Ebert when he said that no good movie is too long and no bad movie is short enough. I'm the sort of person who goes to 12-hour Lord of the Rings marathons, so I'll say it again right up front. I am not opposed to long movies. But something needs to change. Killers of the Flower Moon will be remembered as one of the best movies of the year, but every single review has to be caveated with some sort of comment on its length. Now, unlike some movies that are just padded with unnecessary filler to artificially increase the runtime, Killers of the Flower Moon can justify its length of 3.5 hours. It is telling a very sensitive, nuanced story about a deeply traumatic historical tragedy. This is not a story to rush through, and Martin Scorsese was right to take all the time he needed to tell it in the way that he did. Make no mistake, it's an outstanding piece of cinema. But it would have been nice to have an intermission in there. You probably saw the news that some theatres in Europe and the US inserted one in themselves, despite that being a breach of their licensing agreement with the distributors. Those cinemas quickly got a sternly worded letter from Apple and Paramount telling them to play the movie as originally intended, and I actually agree with them. Theatres should not go against the intent of the artists and should play movies as the filmmakers wanted them to be seen. I have been in theatres before that artificially inserted an intermission into a movie, and it was always jarring to suddenly have the screen turn off and the lights come up halfway through the film. It totally rips you out of the story, and I am not advocating for that at all. I don't want theatre owners to be the ones bringing back intermissions. No, I want filmmakers to be the ones bringing back intermissions. I want them to be the ones to intentionally write a break into the film, to build it into the narrative and use it as a way to enhance the story being told. Not for every movie, of course. In fact, most movies are better off without them, but that's because most movies aren't 3 hours long. My request to filmmakers is that if your movie is starting to approach the 3-hour mark, then you should seriously start considering working a break into the structure, because that's around the time the audience's human discomfort levels start to outweigh their interest in the story. Because unlike a lot of kids these days type sentiments, I don't think people having an aversion to long movies has anything to do with social media or TikTok driven short attention spans or whatever. The success of Oppenheimer, Avatar 2 and Endgame proved that audiences are still happy to see a long movie if it is good. This isn't about attention spans, it's about the biological fact that it is just physically uncomfortable for most people to sit in a single seat for 4 hours without once getting up, stretching or going to the bathroom. There's a famous quote by Alfred Hitchcock that you're probably expecting me to use around about now. But like a lot of famous quotes by famous people, it turns out to have been misrecorded and misquoted over time, so let me take this opportunity to set the record straight. Hitchcock was an early proponent of keeping movies short and sharp. None of his 50-odd films were longer than 2.5 hours, and only 7 of them were longer than 2. Anyway, he was being interviewed about this once in 1966, and he said, "Bernard Shaw once tried to figure out how long an act of a play would be based on the endurance of the human bladder. And that is our fundamental problem when we devise a film. We do ask a person to sit there for 2 hours, and therefore the shape and story shape comes into it considerably, because as you get towards the end, when they, your audience, might begin to be, shall we say, physically distracted, you must increase the interest on the screen to take their minds off this kind of thing." So even though he's been misquoted for more than half a century, Hitchcock's point here is still just as valid today as it was in the 60s. The reality of being a filmmaker is that the longer your audience goes without a break, the more likely it is that they will start to become disconnected from the action, because the very real-world irritants of uncomfortable seats and a swelling bladder will start encroaching on their viewing experience. Your movie has to be damn good to distract people from that, and even then it may not be enough because of, biology. Also, let's not forget the fact that cinemas are squeezing more and more adverts and trailers in before movie showings. It's not uncommon to sit through half an hour of ads before the feature presentation. Suddenly, Killers of the Flower Moon becomes a 4-hour commitment to the chair, not a 3.5-hour one. So if you're going to make a long movie, why not acknowledge that and structure the story around those very real audience discomforts, instead of just dismissing them and telling people to harden up? When Martin Scorsese defended the runtime of Killers of the Flower Moon, he said that, "You can sit in front of the TV and watch something for 5 hours. Also, there are many people who watch theatre for 3.5 hours. You give it that respect, give cinema some respect." And that is very true, but rarely do audiences watch 4 hours of TV in a single sitting without ever once standing up or pausing for a snack or a bathroom break between episodes. As for theatre, well, I don't know what shows Marty is going to, but theatre has always taken advantage of intermissions to give both the actors and the audience a break. Pretty much every single play has an interval structured into the story by the playwright. When done well, that means the intermission will come at a particularly high point of the dramatic conflict, ending the act on something of a cliffhanger. So audiences get this jolt of excitement and then get the chance to stretch their legs, go to the bathroom, check their phones, and discuss the first half with the person they came in with. They return to the second half with a refreshed sense of energy and excitement for the conclusion. This is how theatre has worked for hundreds of years, but it was also how movies worked until fairly recently. In the early days of cinema, an intermission was needed simply to give the projectionist time to change film reels, but it also reflected audience expectations by following the format of traditional theatre performances. Of course, an intermission also meant audiences would buy more snacks and drinks at the bar, so it was good for theatre owners as well. This was actively encouraged by the cinemas. They began playing that notorious jingle during the break that you probably associate with The Simpsons.
Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Even if I wasn't hungry, I'd be tempted to leave the cinema just to escape hearing that. But the thing about intermissions in older films is that, like in a stage play, the story was crafted from the beginning to have a break, and the filmmakers intended for it to be watched that way by audiences. And this was particularly the case for longer movies. Martin Scorsese himself posted a list of some of his favourite widescreen movies on Letterboxd. The ones that are longer than 2.5 hours, like Once Upon a Time in the West, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Lawrence of Arabia, had intermissions. In fact, pretty much every one of those legendary movie epics that you read about in media studies but never actually watched, like Ben-Hur and Gone with the Wind, did the same thing. By building the intermission into the presentation of the story, these films acknowledged their lengths, but intentionally structured their acts in a way that would give the audience a break without impacting the flow of the story. A recent example of this you probably have seen is the Lord of the Rings extended editions. While not an intermission in the traditional sense, these 4-hour-long movies were spread over 2 discs when they were released on home media, basically forcing audiences to have a break in the middle. But the break is a very natural part of the story and is timed perfectly between acts because it was an intentional decision by Peter Jackson and his editors to put it there. This is why it is important for the filmmakers who deeply understand the story to be the ones to choose where the intermission goes, rather than just trusting the theatre owner to put a random cut halfway through the action. But the intermission started to be phased out of English language movies around the 1980s. Richard Attenborough's Gandhi was pretty much the last major English movie to have one, and that came out in 1982. I keep saying English movies, by the way, because intermissions are still a very common feature in cinemas around the world. In fact, intermissions are a particularly noteworthy feature of Indian cinema, but you'll need to watch Patrick Williams' videos if you want to learn more about that. But for most of the people watching this channel, we don't have intermissions in movies anymore. Why not? Well, we stopped seeing them around the time the multiplex became mainstream. See, cinemas used to be smaller, 1 or 2 screen outfits, again, much like a traditional theatre. It was easy to manage people coming and going because everyone was there for the same showing at the same time. When big multiplexes came along, it became much harder to police an intermission when you had a dozen screenings at different times to keep track of. They also added time to the film schedule that made it harder to maximize the number of showings the theatre could manage in a single day. Intermissions became less practical for theatres, but this kind of didn't matter anymore because movies were getting shorter. I took the highest grossing movie from each year going back the last 70 years and looked at their average length per decade. It's not the most scientific measure, but I do think it's indicative of a trend. In the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, the average length of the most popular movies was about 145 minutes, a tad shy of 2.5 hours. This average was skewed by longer movies like 𝗵𝗵𝗲𝗄, Spartacus, the 10 Commandments, and so on, all of which topped the 3-hour mark and all of which had intermissions. But then the 70s came along and brought with them Jaws, Star Wars, and the rise of the blockbuster. In the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, the average length of the highest grossing movies dropped by over 20 minutes to just 2 hours. In fact, between The Godfather in 1973 and Titanic in 1997, a period of 24 years, not a single one of the highest grossing movies in any given year was longer than 3 hours. In fact, besides Towering Inferno, none of them were even longer than 2.5 hours. The popular movies were no longer big, drawn-out epics, but short, sharp blockbusters. James Cameron broke this trend with Titanic, which managed to combine the mass appeal of a modern blockbuster with the classic epic historical dramas from the golden age of Hollywood. No wonder it became the biggest movie of all time. The late 90s and early 2000s saw the average movie time creep up over the 2-hour mark again, but in the 20 years since 2003, the average length of the most popular movies for each year has been 146 minutes, nearly 2.5 hours, and pretty much exactly the same average length as the most popular movies from the 50s and 60s, which had intermissions. Do you see where I'm going with this? Martin Scorsese said audiences should show cinema the same respect they give theatre, and I agree. But there's a flip side to that, which is that filmmakers should give audiences the respect that theatre does and let them go to the frickin' bathroom. James Cameron defended the long running time of Avatar 2 in a similar way to Scorsese. I don't want anyone whining about length when they sit and binge watch television for 8 hours. Here's the big social paradigm shift that has to happen. It's okay to get up and go pee. I have another suggestion. Why not just build that opportunity into your movie? I hate it when I'm enjoying a film and someone has to shuffle past me and trip over my bag because they need a bathroom break. Avatar 2 was as long as it was, not so much to tell its story, but to allow audiences to marvel at the scale of Pandora and the beautiful, unique, amazing world that James Cameron and his team created. I understand the joy that comes from immersing yourself in a movie and its world. It's one of the things that makes the theatrical experience so good, but that immersion is ruined when an audience member has to scooch past you.
Now a question of etiquette. As I pass, do I give you the ass or the crotch?
I'm confident that talented filmmakers like James Cameron and Martin Scorsese can come up with creative ways to deliver an intermission that's more interesting than a blank screen with some music. You know how the end credits of Avatar are just a bunch of shots of the forests of Pandora? Well, imagine if Avatar 2 had, say, a 10-minute long interval where the only thing on screen was beautiful nature documentary style cinematography of Pandora, set to that fantastic score. What a way to keep people invested in the world and story, but also let them go pee without disrupting the movie. Or what about one of my favourite scenes from Killers of the Flower Moon, when Molly tells Ernest to stop talking and just sit and listen to the storm. We cut to a wide shot of the house with nothing but the sound of the rain, then move on with the film. I know it's a bit early in the movie for this, but just by way of example, wouldn't it have been beautiful if we had had an intermission there? But instead of a blank screen, we just had a 10-minute long, unbroken shot of the house in the storm, with the sound of the rain filling the theatre. It works thematically with the story, but also gives the audience time for a break. Instead of reviews complaining that movies began to drag in their third act, instead people would go back to their seats hungry for more. Plus, when the filmmaker is the one to make the intermission like this, you don't run the risk of cinemas using it as an excuse to just play 10 more minutes of adverts. This is my whole point. An intermission is not a commercial break. It is part of the story and should be treated that way. But theatres can profit from intermissions in another way, and they've known this for decades.
Let's all go to the lobby.
Theatres are more than happy for audiences to have a second crack at the concession stand. They tend to make a lot, if not most, of their profits on their ridiculously overpriced drinks and snacks, so why wouldn't they want people to come back for seconds?
I do love that money, sir.
With Oppenheimer and Flower Moon, some cinema owners were actually complaining that people weren't buying as many snacks or drinks as they usually would because they were essentially planning mini hunger strikes so that they wouldn't have to leave the cinema for a bathroom break. I don't know about you, but I don't think watching a movie should have to be a test of physical endurance. That's why audiences were also in favour of the intermission. The CEO of 𝗈, a cinema chain in the UK that put intermissions in Flower Moon, said that our recent market analysis showed customers would like to see the return of intermissions. And so far we've seen 74% positive feedback from those who have tried our interval. And to be fair, some directors have actually made efforts to bring them back. Peter Jackson presented his 3-hour-long remake of King Kong with an intermission in some showings to make the movie more of a prestige event, while also being a bit of a callback to the film's legacy in the glory days of Hollywood. Quentin Tarantino went one step further with the Hateful Eight. He did what was called a roadshow presentation, which included a full overture and intermission showing off Ennio Morricone's score, common features of long movies back in the day that went out of fashion in the 70s and 80s. Even Zack Snyder managed to get intermissions into some of the theatre showings of his 𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗲 League cut, acknowledging that 4 hours of movie is just way too much to sit through in one go. But these were all fairly niche presentations, designed to appeal to film history geeks like Peter Jackson and Quentin Tarantino. But that's why I think someone like Martin Scorsese is a perfect candidate to bring the intermission back into the mainstream. Like, take a look at his list of companion films for Killers of the Flower Moon. When Marty fell in love with movies, a lot of them had intermissions. I think that was part of what made going to the movies something special for him, and it was especially what made big, long epics such memorable cinematic experiences. Most of Scorsese's recent movies have been longer than 3 hours, and I'll say it again, this is not a bad thing. But I would love it if he used his extraordinary filmmaking talent and industry clout to make the intermission a standard feature of longer movies again, so that instead of people leaving the cinema talking about how long the film was, they can instead reflect more deeply on its themes, ideas, characters, and story. It would be good for theaters, good for audiences, and good for movies. It's time to bring back intermissions.